Okay, so we've all been there, right? Standing over a tricky putt, trying to just like feel the line, and it just doesn't go in. So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack something called baselines. And honestly, when I first looked at this, I was pretty intimidated. But once we break it down, it's going to give you a whole new way of seeing the green.
Yeah. It's a pretty big mindset shift, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah. So walk me through it. Where do we even begin with this?
Well, the whole premise is we're going to move away from this uphill, downhill kind of thinking and look at the putting surface as like a giant clock face tilted in space. And the hole is right at the center of that clock face.
Okay, I can picture that.
Yeah. So then you picture this imaginary line running from the highest point on the green through the hole down to the lowest point, and that's called the fall line. And that's like our 12 to 6 axis on the clock.
Okay, gotcha. So the fall line is basically the steepest path the ball could take through the hole.
Exactly. And we figure out how steep that is by measuring it as a percentage. So we look at how much the green drops vertically over a certain distance along that fall line. So for example, if the green drops 2 centimeters over a 100-centimeter run, that would be a 2% slope.
Okay, makes sense. So we've got this tilted clock face. We've identified the fall line. We know how to measure the slope of that fall line. What's next?
All right. So now we bring in the baselines. So imagine drawing a straight line from your ball to the hole. That's your baseline. It's kind of like the hour hand of our clock.
Oh, okay. So if I'm putting from 3 o'clock, the baseline's that straight line from the ball to the hole, pointing at the 3.
Exactly. And we measure each baseline's angle clockwise from that 12 o'clock position. So your 3 o'clock putt would have a baseline angle of 90 degrees.
Got it. All right. So I'm following so far. We got the clock face, the fall line, and now these baselines. But to be honest with you, I'm still not quite seeing how this is helping me make more putts.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Because every baseline actually has a left-right tilt to it. So you can think about it like this. If you were to balance a marble on that baseline, which way would it roll? That tilt is what dictates how much your putt is going to break.
Hold on. Every baseline has a tilt. I thought it was only side hill putts that break.
Right. That's a common misconception. It all comes back to the fall line. So putts on that 12 to 6 axis, straight up or straight down the fall line, they have 0 tilt, so they won't break. But as you move away from that axis, the tilt increases. So think about like the 9 to 3 axis, that side hill line. That's where you'd have the maximum tilt, which is going to be equal to the full slope of the fall line. And then all of those other baselines fall somewhere in between.
Okay. So if I'm putting from, say, 5 o'clock, there's going to be less break than if I was putting for 3 o'clock. Because that baseline has less tilt. But why is that? Like, what's physically causing that tilt?
Well, you can think about it like if you have like a ball rolling down a tilted board, right? The steeper the board, the faster the ball's going to accelerate, and the more it's going to curve. So on the putting green, gravity is kind of like our board. And the tilt of that baseline is essentially a fraction of that fall line slope.
Okay.
So that's influencing how much gravity is going to pull that ball sideways.
Okay, that helps. So I'm starting to see how this baseline system can help me visualize the break. But how do we actually calculate? Like, how many inches is this putt going to move? Do I have to, like, become a geometry whiz and calculate angles and stuff every time I'm on the green?
No, thankfully not. There's actually a simplified formula that we can use to take some of the guesswork out of this. So assuming we're on like a standard Stimp 10 green, the break in inches is roughly equal to the fall line slope percentage divided by 2. And then you multiply that by the distance of the putt in feet.
Okay, that sounds pretty manageable. So if I've got like a 7-foot putt from 5 o'clock on a green with a 2% fall line slope, the break would be 2 divided by 2, which is 1. Times 7. So I'm looking at about a 7-inch break.
Exactly. And then, if you're on a faster green, say like a Stimp 11, you just add about 10% to that break. Slower green, like a Stimp 9, subtract 10%.
So it's all about just making small adjustments.
Yeah.
Based on the green speed. But you said this was a simplified formula. Does that mean there's like a more complex way to calculate break using like the baseline tilts that we talked about?
Yeah, you can definitely go down that rabbit hole. But honestly, for most golfers, it's not really necessary. Both methods, whether you're using that simplified formula or you're really diving into the trigonometry of the baseline tilts, you're going to end up aiming at roughly the same spot.
So why even bother learning about the baseline tilts then? If we can just use this like easy formula, isn't that just adding more complexity?
Well, I think understanding the tilts really gives you that deeper understanding of like the patterns on the green. It's about more than just the calculation. So by kind of internalizing these tilts, you can start to develop a feel for how different putts are going to break, just based on their location relative to that fall line.
Okay.
So it's like adding another layer of intuition to your putting game.
Yeah. Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here, but this still feels like a lot of information. Is there a way that we can like simplify our practice and like focus on mastering the most important baselines?
Yeah, definitely. I would say focus on those putts from like 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and 11 o'clock, along with like their opposites, those baselines. Because of like the symmetry of the clock face, they actually cover 8 of the most common putting scenarios that you're going to encounter.
So by mastering those key baselines, I'm essentially unlocking an understanding
Of their symmetrical counterparts as well.
Okay. That's incredibly efficient. So what about those ball above or below the feet putts? How does that tie into this whole baseline system?
Right. So that's where things get even more nuanced. And we really start to see how your handedness comes into play. So remember how we talked about the baselines being either above or below that 9-3 side hill axis?
Yes. That 9-3 axis being the side hill line, running perpendicular to the fall line.
Exactly. So for a right-handed golfer, putts from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Those are ball above feet putts.
Meaning the ball is positioned slightly higher than their feet.
Right. And for those putts, whether they're uphill or downhill, the break is always going to be towards their feet.
Interesting. So even though a 2 o'clock putt is downhill, it'll still break towards a right-hander's feet.
Exactly. Now, putts from 6 o'clock to 12 o'clock, those are ball below feet for a right-hander, and they'll always break away from their feet.
So a 10 o'clock putt, even though it's downhill, breaks away from the right-hander's feet.
Precisely. It all comes down to that baseline position relative to your stance. Now, for a left-handed golfer, this whole pattern is reversed.
Okay. So for a lefty, ball above feet putts. Those between 6 o'clock and 12 o'clock break towards their feet.
Yeah.
And ball below feet putts. Those between 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock break away.
You got it. It might sound a little complicated at first, but once you kind of visualize that clock face and the player stance, it becomes a little more intuitive.
So to sum it up, break direction is determined by both the baseline position and the golfer's handedness. It's like a secret code that unlocks how the putt will behave.
Exactly. And this is why mastering those specific baselines, like the 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, plus their opposites, is so valuable because you're not just learning 8 individual putts, you're learning 8 fundamental patterns that repeat themselves all over the green.
So it's about recognizing those patterns and adapting to them based on where you're putting from. And that's where the beauty of symmetry comes in, right?
Absolutely.
We've touched on this briefly, but it's worth emphasizing.
Yeah. Let's take like a 5 o'clock putt for our right-handed golfer. Uphill, breaks towards the feet. Now look at that 11 o'clock putt. It's diagonal opposite. What do you notice?
It's downhill. It breaks away from the feet. It's like a mirror image of the 5 o'clock putt, but flipped.
Exactly. So they're both 60 degrees away from that side hill line. They have the same baseline tilt, but they're uphill, downhill. And towards away characteristics are reversed.
So by understanding the 5 o'clock putt, I automatically understand the 11 o'clock putt as well.
You got it. And this applies to all the baselines. So the 4 o'clock putt and the 10 o'clock putt are another diagonal pair, and so on. So it essentially cuts the amount of information that you need to absorb in half.
Wow. This is incredible. So by practicing those 4 key baselines, plus their downhill diagonals, we're essentially mastering 8 of the most common putting scenarios.
That's the power of the system. It breaks down the complexity of putting into these manageable, repeatable patterns.
It's like somebody finally gave me the instruction manual for reading greens. But before we go putting this knowledge to the test, is there anything else we should consider? What about like green speed and distance control? How do those factors influence our approach using this baseline system?
Green speed and distance control, yeah, those are huge. So remember that simplified formula we talked about for calculating break? The fall line slope divided by 2 times the distance? Well, that formula is based on a stimp 10 green.
Right. So if the greens are faster or slower, we need to adjust our calculations accordingly. You mentioned like adding 10% for a stimp 11 or subtracting 10% for a stimp 9 green.
Exactly. But it's not just about the calculation. Green speed also affects how the ball reacts to the slope.
Okay, so on a faster green, the ball will travel further. Be more sensitive to that tilt.
Exactly. So a small amount of tilt might translate to a significant break on a really fast green. And then on a slower green, the ball might not react as dramatically to that same tilt.
Okay, so green speed impacts both how much we adjust our aim and how the ball behaves on the green. Okay, so we got to factor that in. When we're visualizing our putt, what about distance? How does that come into play?
Yeah. So distance is obviously a huge factor, and it's directly related to both break and speed control. So the further the putt, the more the ball is going to be affected by the slope, and the more break you're going to have to account for.
And that's where that simplified formula comes in handy, because it factors in distance.
Right.
Yeah.
But distance also plays a critical role in speed control, you know? It's not enough to just aim correctly. You need to deliver the ball with the right pace as well to give it a chance to fall in.
And that's where experience and feel come
Yeah.
in, right? There's no formula that can tell me exactly how hard to hit the putt.
Absolutely. That's where practice. And
Yeah.
getting to know your own putting stroke on essentially at green speeds is really essential.
So even with all this newfound knowledge about baselines and break, putting still requires that element of touch and artistry.
100%. This system gives you a framework for understanding like the mechanics of putting, but it doesn't eliminate the need for skill and practice.
Right.
It's about combining this knowledge.
With your own feel and intuition on the greens.
So it's like having a map, but still needing to know how to navigate the terrain.
I like that analogy. So this baseline system is your map. It shows you the lay of the land, the slopes, the break, but you still need to read the greens, assess the speed, and trust your instincts to get the ball in the hole.
Man, this has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I've unlocked a whole new level of understanding. When it comes to putting,
I'm glad to hear that.
as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this? What's the key to putting all this knowledge into practice? I would say the most important thing is to start observing these patterns on the course. So visualize that clock face, pay attention to the fall line, and see how the break changes based on the baseline. And your handedness, don't get bogged down in the calculations right away. Just use this system as a guide to develop your intuition and improve your feel for the greens.
Love that. Just start seeing the course
Yeah.
through the lens of these baselines and let that inform your putting. It's a whole new way to approach.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And, let's be honest, often frustrating. Part of the game.
Yeah, it definitely can be.
So to all our listeners out there, go out, test out these baseline principles, and see how they impact your game. And remember, even the pros miss putts sometimes. That's golf. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.